For a long time, ruthless leaders have been the center of intrigue and controversy for humanity, and while we can argue the intent and virtue of their political agendas, but the ferocious methods they use to achieve them are less up to interpretation. Unfortunately, history has delivered more than its fair share of such callous leaders. Some of them are mentioned below. 10. Caligula the Cruel. Caligula was the third Roman emperor, ruling from 37 to 41. He was 25 years old at the time of his accession. Initially, people were pleased by his good governance. But later he fell ill with some sort of brain fever and his behavior changed, or maybe his true nature became clearer. He began to terrorize the members of the Senate by making them run alongside his chariot. He is known to kill anyone who interrupted the performance of his lover. He also sent people from the audience to be eaten by lions in circus. Another evidence of his insanity is his desire to be worshipped as a god. 9. Vlad Tepes. Often described as the most blood-curdling novel of the paralyzed century, many people think of Dracula as a mere fictional character, but many also believe that he was based on an actual person known as Vlad, commonly known as the Impaler, a ruthless monarch. I have killed peasants, men, and women, old and young, who lived at Oblusica and Novoselo, where the Danube flows into the sea. We killed 23,884 Turks, without counting those whom we burned in homes or the Turks whose heads were cut by our soldiers. Thus, Your Highness, you must know that I have broken the peace. History mentions him as the sadist king. He is known to commit the most gruesome impalement in the history of mankind when he impaled around 20,000 men, women and children to be burned, hanged, stabbed and buried alive. He would sometimes insert poles, so rounded it would slide through the body without puncturing any organs, hence increasing the torture and its duration and often putting on a public display for everyone to watch and enjoy. In one particular account, he dined among a forest of spikes topped with impaled corpses. He is thought to have killed 80,000 people, impaling 20,000 of them. He died fighting against the Ottomans. 8. Idi Amin. Amin, often referred to as the Butcher of Uganda, toppled an elected government via coup d'état in 1971 and eventually declared himself the president of Uganda. Motivated by ethnic, financial and political reasons, he started purging his rivals' supporters, and the victims soon started including artists, students, journalists, bureaucrats, lawyers and foreign nationals, and their bodies were dumped in the Nile. The dictator was a literal cannibal and confessed to eating human flesh, which he declared salty and not for my taste. He used sledgehammers to kill people and had an underground prison equipped with torture chambers. The massacre continued for the next 8 years of his reign, and international organizations estimate the number of people killed at 500,000 from a total population of 10 million. He would have continued to rule for many years, but overestimating his power he invaded a part of Tanzania, who in retaliation invaded Uganda, and he fled into exile in Saudi Arabia where he died of organ failure. 7. Pol Pot. When the U.S. extracted its troops from Vietnam, it impacted Cambodia adversely, which was already dealing with criminality and incompetence of its government. Pol Pot saw the opportunity and ordered its army of teenage peasants to march into Phnom Penh and seize the control of Cambodia. He initiated the execution of his vision of an agrarian economy, inspired by Mao Zedong revolution in China, the moment he was in power. Everything Western, including city life, religion and influences, were destroyed and replaced by the communist way of life. Foreigners were deported, embassies were evacuated, and the use of foreign languages was prohibited. He eliminated education and healthcare. Residents, around 2 million, were forced to evacuate on foot to the countryside, which led to the death of 20,000 people on gunpoint. Millions of people who were familiar with the urban life were forced into slavery for 18 hours each day. People started dying from exhaustion and malnutrition. Ethnic groups were also purged, with almost half of the Chinese population wiped out. Thrashing people until they died, running them over with bulldozers and burying them alive was so common. Thousands of Cambodians were forced to dig their graves, which is now called the killing fields. Pol Pot's dream of forming a communist society cost Cambodia the lives of 25% of the country population from malnutrition, exhaustion, and overburden. 6. Leopold II of Belgium. Belgium is never the first, or even second European country our mind thinks of when we're asked about one of the world's bloodiest massacres. But, at the peak of European imperialism in Africa, there was a time when King Leopold II of Belgium reigned an empire so vast and cruel that it even managed to put to shame the worst crimes in the centuries that followed. To protect the inhabitants of what is now Congo from slavers, Leopold carved out the world's first private colony, the Congo Free State, in the heart of Africa. First, he introduced the dehumanizing ivory trade, but when the demand for rubber increased, he started kidnapping local inhabitants to work for him in the jungle. He raped his native women. He exploited the resources of Congo and milked everything for the development of Belgium. He imposed gold and ivory quota, and those who failed to meet it had to face mutilation. The area may have had up to 20 million people before colonization, but at the time of the 1924 census, the numbers had reduced to 10 million. It is assumed that the 10 million who disappeared off the face of the earth was most likely dead. But not a single caused the mass death. It was due to diseases, malnutrition, overwork, infections from mutilation, and outright massacre of the rebellious and fugitives. 5. Timur the Lame. When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble. Last of the ferocious conqueror of Central Asia to achieve the insurmountable military triumphs, Timur built an army of several thousand horsemen and went on to conquer the world from Damascus to Delhi. He destroyed Persia, invaded Russia, demolished Mesopotamia, seized India, Syria and Turkey to name a few, and even today, around 600 years later, these cities have not recovered even a fraction of the glory they lost to Timur's barbarianism. The massive scale of notorious bloodshed and desolation he caused gave rise to many ferocious legends. He ordered to behead 90,000 inhabitants of Baghdad, only to build towers with their skulls. Historians recall 28 such towers were built with 1,500 skulls each. Entire populations of cities he conquered were turned into ashes or cut into bloody ribbons. His ruthlessness didn't even spare the cattle, cats, and dogs. At Shivas in Turkey, he promised no bloodshed in return for their surrender, and he kept his word by burying 3,000 prisoners alive. Historians estimate that his armies massacred 17 million people, which made up 5% of the world population at that time. 4. Adolf Hitler. The man needs no introduction, whose mission, till his last breath, was to purify Germany from Jews. In his reign, he didn't allow Jews to live in a peace, depriving them of basic rights and needs and killing around 6 million of them in the Holocaust alone. He murdered them in gas chambers, made them die through starvation, and forced them into slavery. He purged 70,000 disabled people because of their inability to work. He provoked World War II by attacking Poland, which eventually cost 70 million people their lives, including the 800,000 Jews who died by starvation, shooting and gassing. At Auschwitz, 2 million people were murdered in a large-scale process that resembled an industrial operation. Hitler killed around 500,000 Soviet Jews after his invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, marking a new level of ruthlessness in warfare. He placed war prisoners in camps where they around 2.6 million starved to death and another 500,000 were shot mercilessly. All in all, he killed 11 million civilians brutally and cost another million their lives due to hunger and deportation. The impact of his barbarianism was so vast that the survivors of the Holocaust struggled with its bitter legacy in the decades that followed. When Germany lost the World War II in 1945, he committed suicide. 3. Joseph Stalin. A politician who made his way to power by prowling over the dead bodies of his accomplices and rivals, Joseph Stalin was known for his rough and ferocious attitude. One death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. It was under his rule when the Soviet people suffered from industrialization and the famine of the 30s that affected 14 to 40 million Soviet people, with many eventually losing their lives. In his reign, called the Reign of Terror, 1 million people were arrested, another million massacred, 4 to 6 million forced into slavery, 10 to 12 million people relocated, and 6 to 7 million people starved due to artificial famine. Most of the killings ordered by Stalin happened in the time of peace and was related to his vision of modernization. And even today, after brutally killing millions of his people, his place in Soviet history is not clear, because he also helped beat the Nazis and put Russia on the triumphant side of the World War and pushed the Soviet Union towards the esteemed status of a superpower. But no matter the consequences, he is still remembered as one of the most notorious men to walk on the face of the earth with the blood of around 40 million people on his hands. 2. Genghis Khan. A Mongol legend describes that when he was born, he had a blood clot firmly clenched in his fist, an omen of him destined to become a great but a ruthless leader. It came true when that young boy forged the Mongol Empire, and by 1206, he ruled all of Mongolia and pronounced Genghis Khan, the kings of kings. His conquests were characterized by utmost cruelty and around 40 million people died during his reign. Censuses from that time confirm that the population of only China reduced by millions during his lifetime. When he invaded Khwarezma, he ordered the beheading of everyone including the women and children. Pyramids were erected in his name and glory. In one instance, he sacked the entire city when a traitor affronted him. To teach him and his subjects a lesson, he poured molten silver in his eyes. His soldiers also stabbed pregnant women and removed their fetuses. They would snap the necks of the disobedient and disloyal men and choke them out. Over the course of his reign, he single-handedly wiped out an estimated 40 million people or 11% of the world's population. 1. Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun, often referred to as Scourge of God, was an unstoppable force that terrorized almost the whole of Europe. In 20 years, he ravaged people from present-day France to the Black Sea and from Baltic to the Mediterranean. He killed his brother to take the crown, and by the time he became king, he had become a byword for mindless ferocity. He brutally smashed through the frontiers of the Roman Empire, in a wave of death and destruction. To gather all the riches of the world, he burned cities to flames and massacred innocent people. He is famed to have said, "There, where I have passed, the grass will never grow again." He is said to have slaughtered an estimate of around 20,000 people in the ethnic cleansing of the Kingdom of Burgundy only. Other figures are unknown and can be very high. He died in bed during his wedding night in 453 AD.